I almost sat back down, Adam. Please be seated. Okay. Please open your Bibles to 1 Samuel 17. 1 Samuel chapter 17. The entirety of our time will be spent in this particular chapter. 1 Samuel chapter 17. You'll indulge me just a moment to express my heartfelt gratitude. You have been incredibly kind and warm and welcoming to me this week. I have shared a table with many of you, and I have really enjoyed my time here, and I don't say that lightly. I appreciate very much the invitation to come and be with you the week and preach the gospel. There is no greater blessing that I have than the opportunity to share the gospel of our good Lord with God's people. And I said at the outset of this study at the beginning of the week, what a great privilege it is that we get to come together and worship God with one another. And I thank you so much for being who you are and for being about what you are about. And may God bless you and continue to bless you in your efforts to serve Him faithfully. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, and were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah. And they camped between Soko and Ezekah in Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. In the Winter Olympics of 1980, there was a great underdog story, and there have been many movies made about it. The great Soviet hockey team was set to win the gold medal. Nobody doubted for a moment they were going to win the gold medal. They were set to win it. They were exceptional. They had played together for a number of years. And yet the young collegiate, level American team comes on the scene and wins. We love the underdog stories, don't we? We like to know the little guy can still whip the big guy. But folks, 1 Samuel 17 is the original David and Goliath story. It's where we actually get that phrase, the David and Goliath events, where the underdog, who should not have won, who had no chance of winning, actually whips the big guy. Folks, this is the story of Israel on one side and the Philistines on the other, and this great valley which no man wanted to be in between them. I'm not going to preach a usual lesson through this. What we're actually going to do is I'm going to try to get you to imagine the events of that fateful day, and then I'm going to give you some applications to consider from this particular text. So just a few things for you. Let's begin where we left off with verse 4. We're pretty familiar with this. It's dangerous talking about stories we know so well, but I hope we can accomplish something worthwhile tonight by looking at it again. Verse 4. And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. Then he stood, and he cried out to the armies of Israel, and said to them, Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Folks, don't just gloss over statements like, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Do you appreciate that at this time in Israelite history, they are a warring people? In fact, you may recall, Israel had really not known years of peace. From the time of Moses to essentially the time of Solomon, they were a people who had constantly been in conflicts and been in wars. When Moses is the leader of Israel, they fight Og, king of Bashan, and other kings in the land leading up to Israel, leading up to the Canaan's land. And then Joshua takes command and captures 31 kings. Folks, these were people who knew war. Do you remember why King David was not permitted to build the temple? Because God said, "You are a man of war. There's too much blood on your hands, David. Solomon, your son, will build my temple." So when it says something like the army of Israel was dismayed and greatly afraid, just take that in for a moment and think, what caused them to be so afraid? They've known war all of their lives. These are young men who grew up fighting. Folks, do you stop and appreciate the man across the field from them, across the valley of Elah? We talk about how tall Goliath was. 6 cubits in a span. Best estimates would be about 9'6". This ceiling's about 10 foot. That means when he stands on his tippy toes, in fact, if he's standing on this podium, his head's poking up one of those ceiling tiles. You appreciate how big this man was? This is the man who's across the valley from the army of Israel shouting to them. Israel had fought great men before. In fact, Og, king of Bashan, some estimates, his bed was 13 foot long. He was a big man. These people had known what it was like to fight giants. You remember Joshua chapter 14 when Caleb says, "Give me the mountain land of Hebron." He tells Joshua that God has been with me, and here I am 85 years old. I want the mountain land of Hebron, though the giants dwell there. They had fought giants before. In fact, Goliath would have been a descendant of those very giants, more than likely. And so here's this man who's standing across the valley from them, 9'6" tall. Notice in verse 5, with a bronze helmet on his head. That makes him just a little taller than 9'6", by the way. He says, he has an arm, or coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. I don't think we use shekels in weight like that. It's probably not very flattering for the most part. Nobody wants to say, well, I weigh 7,500 shekels. Nobody wants to do that. But that's about 90 pounds. Folks, did you catch that? His coat of armor that he puts over his chest is 90 pounds. To put that in just a little bit of a reference, that's half of my weight. He puts half of my weight around his torso to protect his torso while he's in the middle of battle. And then he says that his spear is like a weaver's beam with a head on it that weighs 600 shekels. That's a 15-pound spearhead. 15-pound spearhead. The average sword in that world was about 2 to 4 pounds. But folks, a sword is this long, and all of its 2 to 4 pounds of weight is right here. Don't deny this. You don't even start denying it. You men in the room have played the little hammer game, haven't you? You hold the hammer out. I'm already seeing it. I know. Yeah. You're holding the hammer out like this, and you're trying to touch it down to your nose. You ever done that with a sledgehammer? Little bitty thing, 2, 3, 4, 5 pounds. The spear he's twirling on the battlefield has a 15-pound head on it. Do you appreciate how large a man would have to be to spin that thing around all day on the battlefield? Just to kind of put this in a point of reference, it's one thing to work really, really hard for a couple of hours and then clock out at lunch, and then go back at 1 o'clock after lunch and work a little hard again till about 5 o'clock. Is that how battles work? I've seen a lot of documentaries, but I've never seen a documentary depict guys go out on the battlefield and they're out there killing people and they're working really hard, and then they clock out. Whistle blows at noon. Everybody lays down their swords, don't they? And then they go and they have their little sandwiches by their tents, and then the whistle blows at 1 and they go back out and fight again. No, that's not how that works, is it? So do you appreciate when this says it's a 600 shekels in weight, a 15-pound spearhead, he's going to twirl it all day long. He's going to be big enough to handle this thing throughout the entire day while he's fighting and killing those across the battlefield from him. Some of the bigger men in our world, somebody like Shaquille O'Neal, he's 7'1", his playing weight 324 pounds. He's a man who's built proportionate, right? He's a big, tall man. Goliath makes him look like an average-sized man. That's a basketball goal beside it there. If you couldn't tell, that's what that is. Folks, this man stands underneath the basketball goal and touches it with his head when he stands on his tippy toes. But maybe you need a little bit better visual. There's a rough recreation of what the spear would have looked like. Now imagine, you men that work outside may appreciate this. Something that has a 15-pound head on the end of it is not on a broomstick, is it? This thing's got to be big enough to handle it all day long. And so these men who are standing there, and I don't know who they are, but they're standing there holding this recreated item. You see how big that is in their hands? You see how big that is behind them? Folks, we have got to get it on our heads. Goliath is not just tall. I've been around some tall men. I met Sean Bradley one time when I was in middle school. Sean Bradley played at 7'6". He was the center for the Dallas Mavericks at the time, 7'6". And me in middle school, I came up to his belly button. But Sean Bradley was this big around. You think Goliath was that big around? You know, I've met some men that are 6'5" and 6'6", have chests on them that thick. How big must Goliath have been? How broad must he have been, shoulder width? How thick-chested must he have been? There is a reason, folks. When it says he came out morning and evening, down in about verse 14, 15, and 16, he comes out morning and evening and he is challenging Israel. There's a reason all the men in Israel have the hair standing up on the back of their necks. He doesn't talk like the little girls do. Come out and fight me. He's got this great, brawny, boily voice. And he shouts across the battlefield that shakes the armor. These men are terrified to fight him. Terrified of what he can do. This is one of the most fiercest men who have ever walked the face of the earth. Please appreciate that. Saul's going to tell David later that he's been a man of war since his youth. How big must this man have been when he was only 15 or 16? He's been a trained killer for a long time at this point. And please appreciate, nowhere in this text does it say anything about horses. But we know from biblical history that the army that had the chariots and the horses typically had the advantage, which is why God told the kings to not multiply their horses. God wanted his people to know, I'm the one who's behind this battle. Do you appreciate, folks, Middle Eastern horses, like the Arabians breed of horses, they're not very big horses. Do you understand that when this man steps onto the battlefield, somebody sitting on an Arabian type horse is looking up into Goliath's eyes? I've got a depiction of this. That's actually me and my grandfather and my oldest daughter years and years ago. And here's an artist's recreation of Goliath. There you go. Do you appreciate, folks, when they stand across from one another on the battlefield? This is a man who could take a horse, even a pretty good sized horse, hit it from the side, and knock it over. There is a reason Israel is terrified of this man. Now let's just put some of this together very quickly. You've got this big boily voice. You've got this big broad man. You've got a man who's tall on top of all of that. If Shaq at 7'1" weighs 324, how much do you think Goliath weighs when he walks onto the battlefield? I put some estimates together, and I'm not good at math. I can't spell it even very well without a little spell check. But folks, please understand what I'm trying to drive at here. This is a man who has to weigh over 700 pounds. And it's not because he's overweight. It's because he is that big. It's because he's that broad. It's because he's that muscular, and he's equipped to fight and kill. That's all this man has known his entire life. Now, folks, that's the man that is across the valley from Israel. That's the man who has all of them afraid. That's the man who's challenging God's people. And notice verse 12. Now David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, who had 8 sons. And the man was old, advanced in years in the days of Saul. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to the battle. The names of the 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. You must appreciate, folks, there is a reason Samuel writes 1 Samuel 17 the way he does. He presents this man who is a formidable foe, who has scared everyone to death, and then the next verse, he introduces our hero of the story, David. But he doesn't say David's 12 feet tall. He doesn't say David has got a suit of armor that's it's 95 pounds. He introduces him as the youngest boy of a nobody tribe. And here we have David, depicted across the valley from one of the deadliest men to ever live. Now, as David's story begins to develop in this, verse 16, the Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. In verse 17, Jesse gets David together, and he sends David to his brothers to take some supplies to his brothers, along with the soldiers there. Verse 21, Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. And David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper, ran to the army, and came and greeted his brothers. Then as he talked with them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistine. And as he spoke, according to the same words, so David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. So the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel. Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? You notice even at this point, as the narrative unfolds, you already begin to see a chasm develop between people. You've got the men of Saul. That's who Goliath challenges. They are terrified. They're shaking in their boots. And you've got this young nobody who shows up on the scene, and he hears the same challenge. And yet his response is, okay, who's going to whip this guy? How would you have taken that? If you're one of the soldiers standing around looking across the valley at Goliath, the greatest champion of the Philistine army, and this little boy, this teenager comes around and says, well, is one of y'all going to go do this? How's that going to come across? And yet that's what David does. His brothers actually respond. In verse 28, Eliab, the oldest brother, when he hears all of this, his anger is aroused against David. And notice what he says. Why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you've come down to see the battle. And David's response, like an impetuous teenager, says, what have I done now? Is there not a cause? You almost see this brotherly squabble between these two men. Eliab, his reputation is on the line too. His younger brother's sitting here wondering why nobody else has went out there and fought. Eliab's accusing his teenage brother, just kind of being a pest is what you're being. Why don't you skedaddle back home to Dad's sheep? You're being a nuisance and you're in the way. Notice what happens here. As some of this interaction takes place, Saul hears about it in verse 31. Saul sends for David. Notice David's comment to Saul in verse 32. Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth. He is a man of war from his youth. Please put yourself back there in that event, folks. King Saul is actually set up to be the hero of this chapter. I don't know if you appreciate that. In chapter 9 and verse 2, Saul is actually depicted as a head taller than every man in Israel. If your average Jewish man is a little bit shorter than me, probably about that 5'6", 5'7", something like that, if King Saul is a head taller than every man in Israel, he's the only man that can actually go mano a mano against Goliath. He's the only man that could stand a chance. And yet here is a teenage boy, and that word youth there, that's what it would be. It would be like 14 to 20. Here he is telling the king, why has nobody else went out there yet? Okay, I'll do it. Who's making these decisions here? Who's choosing this boy to go and fight? Who's going to let this happen? And yet King Saul seemingly does. He actually says, well, you really can't. You're just a youth. But then David convinces him. Look at verse 34 and following. David then says to Saul, your servant used to keep his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it, and I delivered the lamb from its mouth. When it arose against me, I caught it by its beard, and I struck and I killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. Moreover, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. You have to commend the young man. I've never fought a lion. I can't imagine it's a very pleasant ordeal. I fought little girls, and they scare me. And so I can't imagine fighting a lion or a bear. Oh my, I couldn't pass that up. But David says, I've taken them. I've fought them. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go out there and I'm going to take care of this Philistine who's no different. Who's no different than the lion or the bear. He's a person who's defying the armies of the living God. Where was their sense of passion? Where was their sense of loyalty or devotion? Goliath called it right. When he challenged the armies of Saul, nobody. David got it better. This is the army of the living God. Who has the right to defy the living God? Folks, I think if you see some of the depictions in the Bible classrooms in the back, sometimes they're characterized a little bit. But I'll tell you, folks, they're probably pretty accurate. You know, a man as big as what we've described, you think his hands look like mine? Listen, I know I'm a big guy. Sometimes intimidating because I'm so big. But you know how big this man's hands must have been? When David gets close enough, all this guy has got to do is take his big old fist and just bop him on top of the head and kill him. He's just got to shatter a couple of the vertebrae back here in his neck and he's dead. He could do that with one fist on top of his head. This is such a drastic contrast between who should be on the battlefield and who is on the battlefield. Because as this is actually unfolding in verse 38 and 39, Saul says, well, if you're going to go fight the king's battle, essentially, well, you can wear the king's armor. But David is so scrawny a boy, so small a man, he can't even walk with Saul's armor. He can't even walk with Saul's armor. Folks, at some point, you got to scratch your head and think, who's running this thing? In verse 37, Saul even says, go and the Lord be with you. Saul, you're supposed to be out there. You're the king. You're the big guy on campus. It should be you wielding the sword. It should be you going toe-to-toe with Goliath. Instead, what we have is this young shepherd boy. I'll tell you, folks, where is David's mind in all of this? You know, as you're reading through this and you're thinking in his shoes, I don't know, maybe you could relate to the young boy who thinks, well, hey, somebody ought to get out there and whip this big guy. Oh, somebody else heard me say that. I'm not saying it out loud again. And yet he says it to the next guy, and the next guy, and the next guy. And then he's before King Saul. Saul, if nobody else wants to go, I'll go. You know, in my mind, I'm almost thinking, I'm missing my chance to back out. I am missing my chance to back out. Notice this in verse 40. He takes his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook. He put them in a shepherd's bag in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. Do you think he's regretting his decision now? Do you think he's scratching his head and thinking, what did I get myself into? I should not have said anything to anybody. And as you're approaching this man, it may be, here's the Philistine across the valley of Elah, and he's thinking, he's not that big. And as he takes another step, and another step, and another step, he's realizing this guy is a monster. This guy is so much bigger than I ever dreamed he would be. And yet as he draws closer, there doesn't appear to be any hesitation in the person of David. Folks, there's no sword mentioned. There is no battle armor mentioned. In fact, the image that's brought to mind from the text is he's refused all of that because none of it fits him. And so what we have is a shepherd boy with a slingshot and nothing else. And he's walking across the valley to one of the most deadly men who has ever lived. And I'm not underselling that. Please understand. One of the deadliest men to ever live. Now, notice the interaction between these two men now. And I'm going to go ahead and call David a man. Even though he's a boy, he's a man. Look at verse 41. The Philistine came, began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. When the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good-looking. So the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. Don't you know that sent terror down every Israelite man's back? And here's a boy facing this giant. And I'll tell you, one of the best parts of the whole story is what David tells the giant right here. Well, this is a preach right here. You guys that do a little lessons once in a while, here's your sermon. Verse 45, David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you, and I will take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, and all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all the assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Now, if you're standing there and you're watching these two men interact, who you putting money on? The spry young man who just rattled off at the lips again? Or the great big brawny fella who has killed and killed and killed? This is nothing new to him. And yet that is precisely who is put against each other. The shepherd boy and Goliath from Gath. How do you think it's going to end? Oh, you already know, but don't cheat. Okay, that's not fair. How's it going to end? Verse 48.
So it was, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it, and he struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword and drew it from its sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Now the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley and to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell along the road to Sheraim, even as far as Gath and Ekron. Then the children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines. They plundered their tents, and David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. Folks, I know we know the story. I know we've read it 1,000 times. I know we've done Bible class after Bible class after Bible class on it, but this is not just a Bible class story. This shepherd boy walks to a man who is twice his height and weighs 6 to 7 times more than he does, who is decked out for battle, armor all around, spear and shield and sword, and David is walking up to him with a slingshot. And yet when this young man gets to him, he slings the slingshot around, hits the man in the head, and down he goes. The underdog of this doesn't even have a sword. Who in the world is going to put their money on David killing the giant when he doesn't even have a sword to him? He takes the giant's sword and cuts his own head off with it. And yet it happened exactly as David said it would, didn't it? David called it. This is precisely how it's going to happen, Philistine. You've defied the armies of the living God. No more. I'm going to kill you, and the carcasses of the Philistines will be scattered for the birds and the beasts. You are done. I don't think anybody could have seen that coming. We've grown up in a world where we talk about David and Goliath. I hope I brought that picture to your mind really, really well tonight. Shepherd boy killing the great giant Goliath. So here's some things for you to consider by way of applications. I've got a few of them. None of them will take long. Number one, young people can and should serve God. And folks, we've got to encourage them to do just that. You know how I say that with such confidence? It's actually quite simple. If you look at the text, the Philistines see their champions dead in verse 51. Verse 52, the men of Israel and of Judah, they get up and they're shouting, whoa, wait a minute. Just a few verses earlier, they're trembling and scared to death. And yet, no, this time they're shouting and they're pursuing the Philistines. Young people have the ability to help influence and encourage other people. And what's remarkable is 3,000 years later, we're still talking about David and Goliath. We're still deriving some encouragement from a teenage boy and his faithfulness to God. Are you encouraged by David and Goliath? Me too. I'm just going to assume that you are. Me too. Folks, young people can have a great impact on other people of God. And so your influence matters. Number two, I want to tread through this lightly, and yet I want to make it clear. Fear in the face of difficulties is a lack of faith. Now, I know that doesn't sound very gracious. But folks, that is consistently what's actually taught in the Bible. When Peter is told by Jesus to step out of the boat and walk to him, when he begins to sink, what does Jesus tell him? You of little faith. You look at the depiction of Israel's soldiers in 1 Samuel 17, in contrast with David. Who's the man who had more faith? The one who had the courage to act. The one who had the courage to do. And so if this is a particular area with which you struggle, then maybe what we need to do is really get together and we need to work on this. Because we need to have good faith, solid faith, courageous faith, that we can face giants. David certainly did. Number 3, we need to see clearly the battle. I don't sense at any point in this story naivety on David's part. I think Eliab accuses him of that, actually, and back up in verse 28. Well, David, what are you doing here? You just need to go home, piddle with the sheep. You're just a little boy who doesn't know nothing. But I'm going to tell you something, folks. I don't think that's an accurate depiction of David. David sees the same Goliath every other soldier saw. David sees the same battlefield that Saul saw. And yet David was the one who had the guts, who had the backbone to step out there and fight Goliath. While everybody else was so distracted by how big Goliath was, they all forgot how big God is. You think that makes a difference? It did for David. How many times does he say that, actually? This guy, he's defying the armies of the living God. This guy, he's wagging his finger at Yahweh. This guy has no business doing what he's doing. Where's everybody else saying those things? Where's everybody else who's being the voice of reason? Where's everybody else who's trying to rouse and encourage and strengthen? It's left up to the young man who trusts God to do what God had always done for him. Now, let me be clear about this. Sometimes we can read a particular story and we get to thinking, well, yeah, but at that point, God had already promised great things to this man. You think about Abraham. Somebody and I were talking today or yesterday about Abraham in Genesis 12. God promises Abraham in Genesis 12, I'm going to do great things through you, Abraham. And then what does Abraham do? He lies to Pharaoh because he thinks he's going to get killed. What do we say about that? Abraham lacked faith. God made promises to Abraham. He lacked the faith to believe God was going to go through with that. But appreciate something, folks. In 1 Samuel 17, David has been given no promises by God yet. David has not been told by God, you're going to be king. David has not been told by God, you're going to have an eternal throne descend from your lineage. None of that's happened yet. David has had nothing to go on except the past experiences where he has had with God. And did you catch it? He mentions that. God helped me with the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be no different. God had seen me through those hard times. God will see me through these hard times. You need to desperately look at the track record of God. Remember us mentioning that last night a little bit? Psalm 23. David consistently found faith by looking at the way God had always been faithful to him. God is one who is consistent. David saw this. And so what feeds out of that then is number 4. We need to trust God. One writer put it like this, and I kind of like it. We must not expect to know in what way the power of God will work with us. The fact that it will is enough. Now understand what we're talking about then. Did David know exactly how God was going to deliver Goliath into his hands? At any point in this passage, do you see God whispering into David's ear, hey David, just kind of walk up there and sling your rock and I'll take care of the rest? Y'all see that in the text? Because I don't. If you see that in the text, you and I need to talk. But it's not there, is it? He trusts on God to do, though he does not know what yet. He trusts God to do. And the fact that God is good and the fact that God is consistent ought to be enough to strengthen us to stay with him, to stick with him and be faithful to him. We sing the song, God is so good. He's so good to me. Do you believe that? Then let's faithfully trust him to be what He's always been. Good. 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 That's how we get through these awful giants. Number 5. Maybe one that resonates so well with many of us. There is no Goliath too great. As you're thinking about this man, Israel had whipped giants before. Israel had whipped giants before. Goliath was no exception to the rule. God was with His people, and He would see them through this. Every single person faces a particular giant in their life, and I don't want to stretch this too far, but every person faces a giant in their life that is trying to get you to defy God, that's trying to get you to cast away your loyalties and allegiance to King Jesus. Every day perhaps, you are being tested. There's something wanting you to abandon your faith, even if it's only temporary. Don't let it distract you. So I don't know what your personal particular issue is. It may be something that you're afraid of. It may be a failure of some kind. It may be complacency or inactivity. It might be depression, either clinical or otherwise. It may be anxiety. It may be your health. It may be something that seems so insurmountable and it's begging you to quit on God. Don't let it. Maybe other things. Maybe sharing the gospel. It may be growing spiritually. It may be something in regards to your home, marital frustrations or tensions in the home. It may be struggling with children who you're afraid will not stick to the faith. It may be struggling with children who have already left the faith. It may be struggling with children who are trying to be faithful and you're wanting to help them be faithful, but you're not sure how. Don't let it get you down. Don't let it distract you. It may be something related to the relationship with the local church. It may be congregational tensions or frustrations. It may be concerns about the future, about the growth of the congregation, about leadership, about numerical growth or spiritual growth. It may be something, but don't let it distract you. Folks, there's nothing out there that God can't handle. I hate to tie it in again, but I'm going to. 1 Peter 5 and verse 7, we cast all our cares upon Him, for He cares for you. There is no enemy bigger than our God. I want you to notice one more time. Look at verse 17 of verse 47 of chapter 17. 1 Samuel 17, verse 47. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with the sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and He will give you into our hands. No Goliath out there is beyond God's strength. Just as certain as David was, we can be. Our victory is certain. Our victory is absolute. And you know how I can say that? Because 3,000 years ago, there was a man named David who understood that victory by God was absolute. There's a reason he went on the battlefield before Goliath, a man so formidable, because he knew God was behind him. He knew God was really the one who was going to win the battle. And so, here we are. Now maybe we should tie this right back in very quickly to some very significant spiritual concerns that we have. You and I are the underdog in our own story. We have at one point or another given in to sin. And sin, much like a 9'6" giant, has wreaked havoc on our lives. And if you try to fight him on your own, I don't know how better to say this, you're going to die. You can't beat a 9'6" giant by yourself. You cannot beat sin by yourself. And yet, what God offers God offers somebody who's willing to step onto the battlefield and whip sin for you. Who's willing to take care of that problem that you and I both have that separates us from the holy God. And so while we're the underdog of our own story, Jesus Christ is the champion. Will you accept it? Will you let Him help? I tell you, I've gotten to know this group pretty well over the last few days. And maybe you're one of the number of this congregation who's been struggling with these very things. Sin has conquered you. I think I can say rather confidently, this group wants to help. And if you're just a visitor tonight and you're not a member of the body of Christ, you're not a Christian, I can tell you again, this group wants to help. We just want to help get you right with God. And that's going to happen through His Son, Jesus Christ. Can we help you or assist you in some way tonight? Please make it known now as we stand and as we sing.